and conceptually got really dense.
See, I was gonna see, I was gonna finish it this evening, but then I ordered a Guinness with dinner, and I thought it was like a cup, and they brought me like a bottle like this, and it was a long, boring dinner with guests I didn't know, and so me and this bottle took up the evening. So we did not finish the chapter. Yeah. But anyhow, so a thought that I've been wanting to bring up from our previous discussions, but haven't done it yet, is this concept of no longer seeing, like, we're coming from the modern, right, and we're trying to like reimagine ourselves in the ancient or Plato's way of thinking, right? And the modern way of thinking is always an subject and object, right? Like person from the outside seeing an object over there. There's an assumption of separation between me and everything else. Our individualism, our concept of self is singular, right? And we look at things that are outside of us. Whereas Perl is trying to tell us that Plato is seeing this knowledge is the unity of what is outside oneself, and what you are. I mean, more than that, it is you, or it is already inside of you. And I'm having a hard, like, I understand it. Like, I understand the words that were said, but I've just realizing that I'm just so entrenched in this, me versus that, me versus the other, that I can't. I'm afraid that, like, while acknowledging Plato, I'm not like yet thinking like that, Um, and I'm wondering if you guys have any practical ideas of like how you would start to do that. What does that look like to start thinking about the world as being found, or like being connected? Real unity. Like that's what Plato defines as being this like integrated unity or unity as together, something like that. He's got this line he uses over and over.
Well, his point with the forms not being somewhere outside but being part of your soul, like he goes into the fact that pre-existence was a metaphor, or like a mythic tale to represent the fact that the forms are already present within the soul, waiting to be discovered and in a sense remembered. The point is that, if you follow the whole argument about what a form is, and that the reason why you can see an attribute shared by different things, like a color, like the color red, the fact that you can identify that it's shared by those different things represents the fact that it is a form that pre-exists those things, that those things share in. And so your apprehension of that means that it's within you. You see it inherently, like you know that the difference between something that's large and something that's small, or rough versus smooth, or something like that. And so it's a distinction within you, and an apprehension of the form within your soul. And that's why it's not just merely an external reality. It's actually an aspect of your soul. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And here's another thing, right? I mean, this is something similar that we talked about. We talked about this last week too, to some extent, where just think about it, right? So there's a sense in which it still sounds weird, right? Like Justin says, what he's talking about is exactly what Plato is getting at. But then the idea is that, why would we think that, right? Like, why would we think that these things are within the soul? Well, just remember, right? What does it even mean to see outside of your field of consciousness, right? Like what external world, to some extent, like external to, like what is the external world, and how would you even know it's there, considering you look at everything through your field of consciousness, right? in many ways the window, the eyes or the window of your soul is what you see everything in. In so many sense, in many senses, your inner world is the most evident reality there actually is, and anything external, who knows what that is, right? Like nobody actually sees that, right? What external world do we see outside of what does it mean to see outside of our conscious, perspective? That doesn't make any sense, right? We don't really behold anything external. And so there is a sense in which, we need to understand, or that, where, part of the implication is, like there is this very tight unity. Like we're just kind of assuming there being this very hard barrier between our mind and the external world, when in reality, you can't really be sure that there is an external world outside of mind or
Okay,
outside of consciousness.
I have a thought experiment that can help if you're winding down.
Yeah, that's all I have to say.
So basically, what I kind of had this thought pretty early on when I was kind of young, but I was thinking about the fact that, according to modern neurology, all of your perceptions are happening within your brain, right? So, as best as we could figure, your light is bouncing off objects, as far as sight goes, and then it's being interpreted by your brain, and then the qualia is happening in your brain. And so the same thing with sound, same thing with touch and all that. So it's like literally you're walking inside your brain. You're not, and that was a trip for me. It was like, oh, I'm not actually like looking directly at the world in a sense, but I'm actually inside my mind. And then the next step is to realize.
Are you saying that that's a view, or you're saying that you believe that?
I'm saying that that's it's a thought experiment. It's like a step in a process of understanding, or like kind of understanding what Naveed's talking about. Then the next realization is that, and this is where it gets even trippier, that the brain itself is a perception within the mind. So, like, it's kind of like what C.S. Lewis was getting at. If you read the essay, let's see, what was it called? It was something about being in a shed, the tool shed, meditation in a tool shed. That's what it was. Looking at versus along. He talks about how, we're always trying to explain perception and things like that, and beliefs, in terms of like, what's something that's happening in the brain, reducing it. But then you look at that process itself, like, well, this neurologist, he's just, these are just thoughts inside his brain. So the brain itself is a perception. So actually, it all comes back down to immaterial mind. It's not, you can't just stop at the brain. It's like, oh, that explains it all. It doesn't work that way, because the brain itself, and also like experiments, scientific experiments, they're part of, you have anecdotes, and then you have scientific experimentation. But the only thing that differentiates scientific experimentation is it's more rigorous and more repeated. It's actually a collection of anecdotes. You know what I'm saying? So everything's happening within this realm of experience, and there's nothing outside of that.
What do you mean that it's a series of antidotes?
Well, what I mean is
not antidotes, but anecdotes.
Well, that's kind of like a weasel word in a way, because an anecdote is like a one-off, or like just a personal experience. But what I'm saying is that there are a set of experiences, and we're testing reality through our experiences. But it's made more rigorous and repeated, and that's what makes it more of a scientific enterprise. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, partly why people would still call it anecdotal to some extent is because, like, they'll say that, well, even though we've done like repeated samples, what they'll say is that, well, if you look at the actual number of samples that really exist, the amount of testing that you've actually done as a percentage of the total, number of times you could test this thing is minuscule. And so there is a sense in which you're actually extrapolating out of what seems to us a very significant amount of data, but which you could say in some sense, from a scale sense, is kind of probabilistic in some ways. If you were looking at it in terms of the total, amount of sample that is available for any sort of thing that you can observe. So that's partly what it means by that to some extent.
Yes, but okay. Well, I mean, this is a good question because it kind of tapped into what I was thinking. Is that like anecdotally, it seems to me that the Earth is kind of flat, or it seems that the sun actually spins and the Earth is stationary. Right? That's not the case, right? Um, so in some ways, this object-subject distinction helps us make or understand reality in a better way. That if we just relied on our senses and our um, anecdotal experience, that we would never get to conclusions that we get to.
Yeah. No,
Right.
it has an
So
important role, of course.
yeah. So I kind of took issue with the way that he says that there, this sort of total collapse of subject and object. Um, I don't know if how useful it is to collapse that.
So the usefulness depends on what you're doing, though. That's the question, right? So
Agreed.
it has to do with, in a sense, what you're trying to discover. So if you're trying to, for example, do the sort of things that science is trying to find, then no, the subject-object collapse thing is not helpful in the least. And that's one reason why, to some extent, you have to, like, if you're doing science, because science by definition is trying to look at these, is an analytic thing. It's trying to create categories. It's trying to create that this is this and this is not this, and these are the behaviors and properties of this, whereas this has these properties or whatever. So when you're trying to do that sort of thing, where you're actually trying to look at things from what you call, like, where you're really trying to self-contain and think about just the practical, how does something respond or act or behave, then yes, you absolutely would not find it useful to collapse subject and object in that situation, because you're not really looking for that kind of data in that situation. It doesn't help you. And so basically, you know what I'm trying to say? So yeah, you're correct that you can't necessarily wear that hat in every situation, if you're not actually trying to talk about, in a sense, the unity of things. When you're actually trying to talk about their particular realities, because they do have a particular reality as well as a united reality. And so that's sort of what's happening, is you're changing focus to some extent.
Yeah, it seems like Plato's trying to widen our eyes, right? Like it's about spiritual ascent, like knowledge and intellect as spiritual ascent. And so yeah, like which can relate. I don't doubt to science, but at least in our modern notion of science, it doesn't necessarily help it or is practical in that sense. But I also wouldn't put it past. I wouldn't put it like totally exclude the two. I bet you could, like, if you wanted to develop a science from Plato's collapsed, worldview, but you could, but it would take you a different route, a different path than modern science has gone on. Because like we talked about the Timaeus, and the Timaeus, Plato is using his like logic to like construct the solar system and the universe and what it does. And I remember the footnotes of Timaeus mentioning how Plato is imagining like geometrical patterns inside patterns, because each one is like conceptually what would be the perfect pattern for this planet's element or whatever. But it's weird how right he gets, even though he's going off a totally wrong, like not a objective scientific system, like according to our view, but he gets weirdly close to the positioning of the pattern of the distance of the different planets in the solar system. So it's kind of, I bet, I don't like, maybe I'm like just, I don't know, going on a limb here, but I doubt, I bet a different science could be made from
No,
from
there's
Plato's.
definitely a place where they intersect, right? That's really it. So it's not like they're actually divorced from each other, because you're talking about reality as a whole, right? So it's not that they're completely unrelated, or that like they don't have any connection points, right? But it's about what kind of data are you looking for in that instance, in that moment, right? It's like
Mhm.
that. It's not a question of like that the fields don't connect. or that their views of reality don't connect. It's more about, well, what am I doing right now at this moment? What am I trying to find out, right?
Hmm.
What kind of question am I asking right now? And in
Mhm.
that situation, when you're talking about these very self-contained temporal, spatial reality sort of things, right? Like things that can happen in terms of our spatial temporal world and the way that we're looking at things, that's where there can be a division, where there's a sense in which there is a divide, or this idea of having the empirical hat on because you're trying to find out something about physical properties, behaviors, and or talking about being in pure being, right? Or talking about its origin and stuff like that, and why it might be this way or that way. So they're asking different questions in that sense, right? But when you're talking about it in an ultimate metaphysical sense, no, they're not apart. It's just that they can come apart in our spatial temporal reality of what we're doing in a single moment because of the nature of how we live.
The problem that I have is that it's so unsatisfying, because the sort of Platonic vision of the world fails at that particular critical moment, where I am looking at the world and trying to come up with empirical truths that I can test and verify. You see what I'm saying? So it's not a theory of everything that holds all models well together. It fails at that particular point. And I think that's kind of where
How?
the naturalistic assumptions and philosophies, because you don't need a metaphysics to do the science, right?
You kind of do. There are metaphysical assumptions being made
Mm-hmm.
in
Well,
order to do
yeah,
science.
yes, but it doesn't make you. It doesn't. It doesn't need you to commit to a certain metaphysical. You could always come back and correct your metaphysics if you're not tied or beholden to a certain set of metaphysical assumptions if you're working from a naturalistic standpoint.
Well, you aren't in this situation either, right? Metaphysics isn't really monolithic.
What do you mean?
It's
But also
subjective.
that our
Yeah.
current natural sciences are developed from a set of metaphysical assumptions
Assumptions,
that
that's right.
that would be based probably in this Western, tradition of Plato and
Yes,
Aristotle.
only kind of
Okay.
only kind of to come back and find out that we don't really need the metaphysical, right? Because it doesn't help me with the naturalistic model that I've built for myself. You see what I'm saying?
Well, but
Except you're not
then
only
it's
dealing
like
with
you're
naturalistic
kicking
questions, though.
away. It's like you're kicking away the scaffold that enabled you to construct that perspective. I mean, every secular ideology has an implicit theology.
That's
And
true, Brian.
particularly
I
those
think
that claim not to, right?
that's true, and I can agree with you on that when it comes to like ethics, like. But in some ways, I feel the Platonic view it doesn't really hold well when it comes to natural sciences.
Holds well in what
How,
sense, though? Holding well doing what?
Well, just in this fact of this, we can't really get rid of the subject object distinction. This particular
Which we're not trying to anyways, right? When we're engaging in everyday life per
Yeah,
se.
but so it's like you're disengaging yourself from your pre-commitment and going to a different school of thought to be able to do that, and then you come back when you want to do metaphysics.
Well, okay, so
Not
I'm
exactly.
not. I think I would just say it's different between saying that you can't get out of subject-object duality in that sort of instrumental realm where you're trying to do things, but it's different from saying that it must apply in all domains, like that it has some kind of a force to say that is just like I would just oppose sort of like extending it to all domains of knowledge or all. I think it's useful.
Which we can do, only then we have to say that it's not an all-comprehensive philosophy that helps me, that I can consistently stay both when I'm doing metaphysics and just natural physics.
okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I
no,
have to say something.
neither of them are comprehensive in the sense of they're not asking about the same parts of reality, right?
Well, okay, but earlier we were talking about experimentation being, a set of anecdotes. Early, it's a set of experiences where you're engaging reality and you're trying to do so consistently, methodically, using control and all that. that you're still engaging through experience, right? Well, how do we come to the point where we think that no matter how many times we repeat it, or like, let's say, it doesn't matter how many times you repeat it, and does that actually imply something about reality itself? Like, are there elves in the machine that are making sure it turns out a certain way each time we do it? Or do we assume that there are laws of nature, and that construct of there being laws of nature is itself a metaphysic, right? And you have the mythological metaphysic of like there being elves in the machine making sure that it turns out that way. And then when you're not doing the experiment, it doesn't turn out that way, you know. So you are assuming something in the background, right? And also, I want to say in the Platonic dimension of things, it is very useful. Like for instance, I think probably the most powerful theory of evolution is what's called structural. Basically, what it is that there are forms involved. Like you have like dolphins and whales. It's posited that they were land mammals that went back to the sea and evolved fins, and so there's a convergence there. Fish have fins, and then also mammals that went back into the sea also have fins, and then there's a form of the fin, or a sort of a sea-dwelling animal, and so there's a convergence between theory of evolution and Platonic forms as well. So it does have some usefulness, actually, in certain regards. And also, like, when it comes to, like, quantum gravity and positing that, it from bit. Now, physics is sort of kind of coming to a point where we believe that everything is derived from information constructs. And so all the things that you see, like there's also panpsychists and all. They're trying to, like, in this realm, trying to figure out what's going on with where reality came from, and integrating general relativity and quantum physics. And the most powerful way they found to do that is quantum gravity, and that results in this immaterial, spaceless, timeless realm from which everything derives, and it's information construct. So that is another way that Platonism actually is relevant in science. So there is a convergence there.
And science
I'm
doesn't
not saying
really even
there's
do
just
interpretation.
Say that again, Naveed. What was that?
Sorry, no, I was saying because even scientifically though, science and metaphysics are both relying on the rules of logic, because really science is only a method of data collection, but actually interpreting what that actually means or what it actually tells anybody is basically tied along. It's basically the same rules that are followed by metaphysics and theology.
Okay, see, I'm not completely disagreeing with whether what Justin and Naveed is saying, but my question is, obviously there are Platonic assumptions that we make about reality in order to do natural science. That's fine. I can totally grant that. But my issue, particularly here, is that when you say that there's no subject. If I take the same Platonic assumption to science, science would not be possible to kind of. So you have to step out of your Platonic assumptions there and do science, and then like revert back to it to be able to continue doing science. Does that make sense?
Well,
You're
why am
kind
I
of
stepping
stepping
out
out
of
of.
Not exactly, because the metaphysics doesn't deny that science is
Yeah.
possible to
Like,
do. You see what I'm trying to say? Like, it's not
I-
answering scientific questions, but it doesn't reject the idea that natural science is legitimate or that you would use that. Like, it acknowledges the idea that there are, like, for example, we still believe that, for example, even if there's a unity beyond all things, there's still, for example, forms and particulars, right? Like, we're referring to things that really do exist, right? And that there is a certain science or a certain way of looking at particulars versus thinking about what the forms are, right? And so in a sense, like, it's not there, it doesn't really, like, in a sense, even try to, in a sense, say that science isn't a legitimate thing or unnecessary because you have metaphysics. Metaphysics is just looking, in a sense, at origins, meanings, aesthetic, ethics, underlying principles. That's what it's looking at. It doesn't really even try to say that it is a science that talks about the things that are like behaviors of things or properties of things. That's literally what it means to observe particulars. That's what natural science does, is looks at particulars. Like they're not mutually exclusive sort of things.
Sure, but that's not my claim. But the thing is, if you take away the subject and the object distinction, which is what the Platonic view seems to be suggesting, as I understand it, then it wouldn't be possible to scientifically, like, for example, like I'll just give an example from the Platonic senses. Like, let's say that I assume that there's no reality to.
Oh, your voice isn't coming through anymore.
Can't hear you, Fraser. It seems like you got unplugged.
Yeah, we can't hear you. Your voice isn't coming through.
Your headphones die?
Let's see if he can fix it. I just want to add one thing, because obviously, if we take a construal of the scientific method, I mean, I would be in favor of retrieving sort of an introspective empiricism as well, right? And sort of saying that there are certain types of empirical knowledge that are only can only be had from that first person perspective, and not in attempting to abstract to a putatively objective, right? One that excludes so I think in principle there are realities that are knowable through introspective empiricism, but and so
right,
I wouldn't want to circumscribe that, right? And also I would challenge, because another assumption that you find in sort of the scientific worldview is a certain uniformitarianism, right? That from a sample of the universe, you can abstract, laws to, every place or every context or every observer in a uniform way. And I wouldn't take that for granted. I acknowledge its usefulness, but I don't know that it's ultimately authoritative, you see.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Yep. Yes,
okay.
Yes.
It's an issue with the Skype setting here. Okay, all right. So let's say that I start with the assumption that there's no reality to begin with, everything is an illusion. There would be no reason for me to study the natural world, because my assumption just makes it impossible for me to do any kind of study of the natural world, because I've just already assumed that everything is an illusion. So if I start with the premise, similarly,
illusion is not sheer nothing though. Like, illusion is appearance, right? It has being. It's just, it's sort of, it's not being in the full sense. So in a sense, like it's kind of like in a dream, you're still, if you run into an elephant smacks you in a dream with its, it's right, like it's got a cudgel in its trunk and it goes bajam, and that still hurts, even if, like, in another standpoint, that's relative, right? Because you wake up,
I'm giving that as an example, right? Like, this is not my point that I'm trying to make. Let's just assume that,
sure.
there's like some weird philosophy out there that just assumes that everything is an illusion, and therefore, there's no point in studying the illusion, right? My philosophical presupposition would prevent me from actually studying the natural world. Now, here's the point. If we start with the assumption that there is no subject-object distinction, that they are all collapsed, and that is my philosophical system, that would also prevent me from looking at something objectively and trying to understand what it is, right? So what I have to do now is, if I want to do the study of this object, I have to step out of my philosophical assumption and undertake a different assumption about the world, and then study it, right? So that is really the heart of what I'm getting at, is that at this particular point, to me, like, if we, like in mathematics, you would have like curves and everything, and you have continuous curves, and then you'd have a discontinuous point at one point, right? Like if you had a point where it was infinite, no, it would completely discontinue. So I kind of see that as like a Platonic discontinuity there. You can't bring that assumption and make science possible if you started with that assumption. I mean, does my question
I mean, I get what you're saying, but I'm just not getting how, like, because again, like, you don't, it's not that you're taking off the metaphysical assumptions when you're doing science. It's just that the fact that everything is unified at a higher level.
I mean, you're not abandoning everything about Platonism when you do science, but you're abandoning the subject object. You acknowledge there's a subject object distinction when you're doing science.
But so does Platonism, right? Platonism does acknowledge that exists at a level. Yeah.
But at a level, kind of like a bottom is like, if there's like rungs of, and that's the level that he talks about, right? Like levels.
Yeah, like there's a place or there is a point where they wouldn't be distinct in any way, but when we're living here, experiencing the world here, the metaphysics of Plato absolutely acknowledges the idea that there are things. And
it's the higher rung that lends the reality to that lower rung.
There's objects you're observing. So like if you look at the language, he doesn't really talk in a foreign language, right? He actually does the metaphysics completely from obvious experience, right? Like, for example, like what I wrote about the forms, he talks about forms acknowledging the idea that there are in fact all these different objects everywhere, and that you and I see them, and that there are people who see them better, people who don't see them better, right? So there's all these distinctions. He has categories, all kinds of categories of assuming that, yes, we are separate people. I have a mind, you have a mind, my mind can see something your mind doesn't see. There are a multitude of objects everywhere that have certain behaviors, and we all have different ways that we look at them. People have different weird judgments about them. There's like all kinds of governments in the world, and then they're all, you know what I mean? Like the philosophy completely talks about particulars as well. Like, it's not really like something that is ignoring the subject object, like the fact that there is a sense in which they are separate, right? Like, it's not really denying that experience, or that there's or that we're not supposed to use that, or that it doesn't have any kind of like bearing on real life. Or
something I like to clarify.
I understand it better now. So it's like, when I see in like at the lower level of reality, it seems like two parallel lines, but they kind of intersect at infinitum. Kind of that idea.
Yeah, because like, think about the laws of the unified force theory and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Like, there is, like, of course we experience gravity, electromagnetic force, weak nuclear force, strong nuclear force as separate forces. But if you look at, when we talk about science, and we talk about like this idea of origins, or we talk about like before the universe expanded to its current size, there was a sense in which electromagnetic, gravity, weak and strong forces were indistinguishable from each other. Mm-hmm. There was a sense in which theoretically there wasn't any difference, or there weren't these what you call differentiated forms, right? Or of forces. And that at a certain point, when the universe reaches a certain state, you have these four distinguishing things that act in individual ways, right? So that's what we're trying to say, is that there is a connection at a certain level, but that doesn't mean that we're not acknowledging the separateness or the qualities they exhibit in our, standard shared reality here.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. I think I understand it better now. Yeah, it's a lot less confusing now. Okay.
One thing I was thinking about was, also we were assuming that Plato does remove the subject-object distinction completely, which he doesn't really. He talks about their marriage or their union, their togetherness, inherent togetherness, that they can't exist, which is just rational that they can't exist apart, right? Even if you are behaving like if you are being one of these things looking at the other, they are still together. You cannot, the process of looking cannot happen unless they're together, right? And that's really the union he's talking about, is that these they coexist. They are, the fact that you're experiencing means that you exist with it and it with you, right? Yeah. And he uses the analogy of marriage or conjugal union, like, and we can take that, like, it's the kind of the higher plane we're talking about can be literally like the world of metaphors and language helps us like visualize that. Like if I say my wife is same as me, like one flesh with me, is she physically like with me? No, like she's a person, I'm a person. But in the world of forms, in the world of ideas and names, we're the same person. If someone hit my wife, they would hurt me, right? We're together in this. There's the same it's a form unity that doesn't maybe exist on this level, right, of bodies, but it exists in the world of, I guess, of this abstraction.
Since you brought up your wife, so this have you heard of the twin flame stuff? Is that a Platonic idea as well?
I don't know about twin flames, but there's like twin stars. You have a star, or a guardian angel. Kind of comes from the Platonic concept that you have a perfect self, I guess. And we don't know. Now reading Perl and realizing how much of Plato's stuff is metaphorical. I don't know how like literal he is being with that, but
is supposed to be.
But he definitely talks about it in the Timaeus we read a while ago. We lost a bunch of people. Where people go?
I scare them away. I bore them away.
We had Zach
and it's more of an issue of it's basically like metaphysics is just trying to say that it's not, that things are not reducible to their properties. You know what I'm saying? Like it doesn't say that there aren't scientifically different properties or behaviors or observable things, but it's kind of basically just trying to say that there are certain things that the behaviors or properties alone do not tell us.
So in some ways, this goes back to the one and the many question. The fact that we can ontologically distinguish one from the other is ultimately the fact that they're ultimately one. Is that a right way of understanding it?
Well, could you rephrase that a little bit?
Never mind.
Well,
okay.
I was saying that like this question of the one and the many, like how can there be so many ontological beings, but ultimately one source to all of them? And how would Plato answer that question? Would he say that like the very fact that we can differentiate between one and the other is precisely because of the fact that we ultimately acknowledge that they're one?
It's kind of step by step, right? Like if you look at, like you don't really figure that out immediately, in a sense of, okay, when you just see the many, Plato acknowledges that like the one from the many is not evident just from like, the sheer, and he mentions that, for most people, they're really, it's not a simple thing, or it can be very hard for one to actually envision a one from which all of this is coming from. And so a lot of with metaphysics and philosophies, it's systematic, right? So he's going from particulars, talking about, well, particulars show some kind of unity because we realize that, well, because we have categories, right? There's a lot of things where many become one to some extent because of our categories, right? So there's one sense in which we have green apples, red apples, or whatever, but then there's a sense in which we just call them apples too. So there's a kind of oneness that ends up being visible even from things that are seemingly different from each other. And so he says from there, you can then perceive even further unities. So there's a sense in which apples plus like bananas plus, whatever, are now all fruits. There's a unity that we find. There's a reason why we call them all fruits, because there's some kind of paradigm or model which makes them all fruits. So now you have another unity. And so the idea is that this happens in an ascending way, is where how it's extrapolated. So it's not something that you just see immediately from looking at the apple itself, but from looking at the way we engage with this stuff, right? How we end up thinking, how we perceive being. And when you start to look at those levels, you start to take it further and further and further, you start to notice these things you start to have even further unities.
I think, Fraser, if you read the section on the good, which is part 7, I think.
Yeah.
It really goes into like how Plato sees this, is because he does talk about parts, right? Like even in this utmost layer, we have the part of what the demiurge becomes, which is like the being, the gathering of all the forms. We have the participation of all the forms of like the real world, and of course there's like those things like the world of ideas, the world of physical things. These all have, there's so many right subcategories, but the thing that doesn't matter what you're looking at, whether it's the most base level of reality that we're in, or if you're in some, again also we're all talking this, but Perl talks that these spatial metaphors are these rungs of reality, and this spatial metaphor is metaphor. So even if you're in the world of demiurge and creation, or down here in lamp and computer monitor and molecules and things like that, the uniting thing is goodness. It's the you talk about goodness being the light by which we can see anything, by which we can relate to anything, is because we see an ordering structure in everything. There is a sense of logic, rationality that it can be engaged with, and that becomes his kind of, I think I didn't get to the end of the chapter, but I bet where he connects, what unifies everything is this light by which everything is seen. The good.
Yeah. It's more like he takes the equation further and further and further, right? That's kind of the idea. Like it's not there right away, but when you keep just trying to follow the pathway from that one apple, which might be green or red or whatever, you start to see convergence. That's kind of the idea, is that you have to just keep taking that equation further, take the logic further. Because you're basically saying that, well, everything is ordered logically, right? So the idea is that, well, okay, just as how if logic works here, then this is going to be, in some sense, the paradigm for also where these things have come from. The idea is that logic is something universal. And there's partly an assumption there that the mind is able to perceive reality directly, right? So the idea is that if our mind is geared towards intellect and knowledge, then everything is sort of on that paradigm, right? So the idea is that even if you can't see something, if you keep using the same laws, you are going to get to true ideas, even if you don't directly see them as discrete objects, in a sense, right? Similar to how, like, for example, I think Neptune was the first planet that we actually found through pure mathematics and not by sight. We actually knew where Neptune was before we saw it, in a sense, because we just followed mathematics, for the idea that, okay, well, if this is this, if this is how gravity is, and this is where the pull of gravity is, and we're detecting this much force or whatever in this area, and certain objects are acting in a certain way in this area of space or whatever, there should be a planet there, right? And lo and behold, there's a planet there. You see what I'm saying? So, but the thing is, we knew that before we even really saw it. And so there's a sense in which metaphysics is saying the same thing, is that, yeah, there's a sense in which you can't see that, or you don't literally see them in the same way you see discrete objects. But just as you can do that sort of thing with, how mathematics and these things predict or sort of come prior even to our direct observation of certain things, that the same is true of metaphysical realities, but that it's possible to see or connect with them at a point. Like, it's not always that you can't perceive them, but that at least, even though you don't perceive them at the current level or state of being that you are now, you have good reason to think that they're there. You see what I'm saying? So we still had to confirm that Neptune was really there. But the idea is that we had good reason to look there in the first place, even though we hadn't seen it yet. And you can get that confirmatory experience in a sense.
Oh, I just have to add that that's another way that Platonic philosophy can provide a good basis for predicting things, and that if you have what do you call it? Is it numeric realism or something like that? But Platonic realisms were numbers. Then it makes a lot more sense why reality corresponds to mathematics, and instead of just having a nominalistic view. You can take a nominalistic view still, but it seems like, you're why, when reality corresponds so well to mathematics. So that's another little thing
So
to say about that.
yeah, I mean that's like true for the black hole too, right? Like even before they actually took a picture of it, like we knew
Yeah,
through mathematics how it would actually look.
yeah.
Which raises the question, like, so is mathematics the most important quote unquote science then?
It is considered a higher science than, certain things. Like I don't know if I would necessarily. I mean, there are definitely different views on whether it's the highest or, but definitely it would be considered what you call like one of the more primary. So for example, like you would consider some of the other sciences being more tertiary or derivative in a sense, right? So mathematics kind of is something that underlines multiple other sciences, because most other sciences, like whether it's chemistry, physics, or whatever, depend on the truth or reality of math, right? That things actually operate on that level. So you would definitely
queen
say
of the sciences.
Proclus in his commentary on Euclid's geometry, right? It's sort of he situates mathematics in between in a way. So it's sort of like a prolegomena to theurgy, right? And sort of it trains you, prepares you for the divine sciences. So it's definitely higher than merely sensory things, but it's not it's kind of, mathematics is kind of a bridge in a way.
Yeah, and also science used to just mean the whole domain of knowledge, like certain knowledge. And so like I said in the chat, theology is the queen of was considered the queen of the sciences, and philosophy, metaphysics, then things just kind of like went more and more into a concrete level. Now science is just considered the natural sciences, empirical and whatnot. But which I think we should come back to the understanding that science is this all-encompassing thing, because really you can't separate them. That science is knowledge. Yeah, I don't think you can really separate them. Like there's a priori and the empirical, but like we were talking about how there's an underlying metaphysical construct and everything. It's kind of hard to separate them, so I don't see why we should. Or maybe impossible to separate them, really.
Yeah. So math is definitely given a very high position. There's no doubt about that. That's something that you'll see a lot. That it's definitely considered to be a gateway to a lot of lesser sciences, but not necessarily the top of the hierarchy.
Something I really liked from this chapter, from the reading, was it began to give me an understanding of how beauty is an ultimate, facet of reality, and how it relates to the good. Because growing up in like Reformed Christian worlds, it like that was kind of thrown around a little bit. That like, oh, like, because like the Reformed Christianity likes to tout that it's very much in the physical world, that it's involved in culture and all those things, and beauty and art is really important to it. And so beauty is this expression of God or of goodness, but they never had an explanation as to why, at least like for me. And like why is the beautiful or like related to any of that? And so I'm finally seeing my answer here a little bit.
Yeah, the classical transcendentals of good, the true, and the beautiful, and they're really one in God.
Yeah, the line I saw was where'd it go? The quote from Plato, which I really liked, was, "Now the power of good has taken refuge for us in the nature of the beautiful, for measureliness and proportion happen everywhere to become beauty and excellence." So the good, basically the good being the integration of everything, components into one complex whole, is the manifest in the whole, that the whole is at once its beauty, its proportion, and its truth. So basically, beauty is goodness happening in the world, which is I like that concept. It's the
Yeah.
coming together of things, and so that's why I don't think we like, nothing about this is rejecting the particulars of the world, the minutia, even opinion. Like maybe Plato does lower the world of experience to opinion, but that's fine because it's the thousands of opinions of humanity that make up, knowledge or consciousness, right? So like the things that we're seeing as the whole are really, we can't scorn the flower because it too is part of the whole, right? Or we can't scorn, right, plumbing because it too is part of the whole, it all comes together, right?
And I think to some extent, like we also sometimes kind of overstate some of the rejection of the lower world and things like that when we look at the language. But when we really think about it, like we have to think about the context in which these people are coming from, right? And what they're talking about. Just like we were talking about the Buddhist thing the other week, right? Like there's a sense in which, yeah, he's saying, oh, metaphysics, don't worry about it. Don't ask all these abstract questions. It's useless. But remember, again, he's Buddha is talking in a situation where the people he's talking to already had a very rich metaphysical tradition. So there was a sense in which what he's trying to say is, I'm not going to add any more to this. You guys are already doing a whole lot of thinking, and you're doing fine with that. But the problem is you've forgotten how to actually go in and empirically experience these realities. You're just thinking about it all the time. So I'm not going to feed your appetite for further metaphysics because that's not what I'm here to do. Like I'm not going to give that to you as much as that's what you want. What I want to do is for you to remember what the point of the whole thing was to begin with, right? So that's the similar idea that's happening with Plato or other Neoplatonists. Is of course there's some that maybe more genuinely would say, oh yeah, the world sucks and it's awful, and like I can't speak for every individual Platonist or whatever, but when you look at it more generally, there's a sense in which, of course, we're not going to just completely reject the world here. We live here, right? And we know that these philosophers were living in the world, right? I mean, they definitely, especially if you look at unlike today where, people are just philosophers or just scientists. In the ancient world, these people tended to be polymaths. Like people didn't just learn philosophy; they also knew the sciences of their day. They knew how what mathematics was like. There was a sense in which people had like a more complete or well-rounded education, partly because it was easier to learn the entirety of science at that point, whereas now like it's moving so quickly that you have to keep updating, and it's tough to master a field. But the point was people tended to have exposure to all of this, and they were also people who were practically living. Like Plotinus was somebody who lived in a practical life in Rome. He was trusted by various aristocratic families with like watching over their kids, and he used to take care of people's estates. He used to be trusted with all kinds of things. And having also lived as a virtuous person. So obviously these people cared about their footprint in the world, right? And what they're doing in the world, and how we should behave and what the consequences of those things are. Right. But so the point is that you don't really have to tell anybody to value the world. It's partly kind of trying to say is that, well, don't just think that what you see and what you're doing every day is all there is, that there's stuff that's behind this, and you have to make other considerations beyond just the obvious behaviors or emotions of particular things. That if we look more closely at that, there are further principles that can be missed if we're not looking closely enough. Right? So we can't just be caught in that, and we have to realize that this is sort of the bottom of reality. It's like the least real of reality, though still real at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, and he went over that in the book about how Plato wasn't saying that this world is just merely an illusion, but that it's just that it's less fundamental. The appearance of things is less fundamental.
You're kind of going in
Example
and out,
forms.
Justin.
Oh, okay. Let me say this again. He said that in the book, Plato wasn't really saying that things are illusory, the appearances of things are illusory or not real, but that they're less substantial, less fundamental than the four forms of which everything is composed.
Contingency, yeah.
Yeah.
They're contingent.
Yeah, we get scared when we use the word less real. We feel like, oh, less important, which is not necessarily what they're saying. They're saying like, yeah, not at all.
Yeah, it's about contingency. Yeah.
Right.
So the idea of proportion that adds to the beauty of and I've learned a little bit about how the ancients used to, and this is applies for architecture and music, and they used the golden ratio to kind of design their architecture and similar musical note constructions. And is there a link between that and alchemy in trying to precisely understand what portions give what? And if so, is that something we need to probably retrieve in the modern world?
Yeah, I watched a video on this once, and alchemy wasn't just. Yeah, alchemy was exactly that. It was the applying of kind of metaphysics to practical things, and we have this negative notion that alchemists were, right, the guys looking for gold out of lead, but the concept of that was looking for the perfect form inside imperfect combinations, which was but the thing, alchemy applied to everything. Alchemy applied to the soul. It applied to it was. I don't know. I forgot my terms. I watched that video a while ago though. I'm gonna try to find it. I think it was the Esoterica YouTube. Have you guys seen that YouTube channel, Esoterica? It's a really cool YouTube channel.
I think I might have heard of it. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, that's the first thing that shows up when I type alchemy into YouTube.
Huh.
Interesting. Because see, I see this coming back in some ways because people who are evolutionary psychologists, they look at the most perfect bodily structure that we find to be attractive. And I've sort of been a little bit skeptical about that. And that's where, to me, how can these ideas of proportion and beauty and forms sometimes be used to support really terrible social causes?
Yeah, usually misunderstanding of what those things actually mean tends to be the problem.
Can you give me an example?
Well, yeah, so in the sense, for example, this idea of there being that forms implies that there's this absolutely perfect body on the basis of certain individual qualities doesn't make a lot of sense, because remember, right, part of what is being referred to when we think about the good is this idea of combination, right? It's about a whole that it's actually greater than its parts. So if somebody just tries to be oh, these are the exact parts that it takes to make this perfect body, that's really not the point, because there's also an issue of its combination. It's the way in which certain things actually connect together, that the parts relate to each other, and that can actually yield a number of different ways in which something can be beautiful. You see what I'm saying? So maybe there are certain kinds of combinations that if you put this and you put that together, statistically it may be less beautiful or not as great. But that same thing, which we might have considered not beautiful in one situation, in another combination of stuff paired with certain different attributes, it could be really great, right? You see what I'm trying to say? So that's
Like the
partly
Hawaiian
partly,
pizza.
huh?
Like the Hawaiian pizza.
Yeah, you see what I'm saying? So like
Yeah,
part
yeah.
of it is it misses the subtlety. Like it's a very brutish way of looking at forms to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the people don't really know exactly what is being talked about with these forms, and sort of what Plato says more specifically about what that actually means, what beauty actually is, what goodness actually is.
So
Because those are
going back um to the perfect form of bagel, um it would be hyper stressing just on the radius and the perfect circularity of the bagel, and not really caring about the taste of it.
sort of, yeah, like I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, in a sense you have to be very careful with sort of, what the, what a form is really implying, or what do you call the essential attributes of something,
Mm-hmm.
versus just looking at all these, particular accidental or combination things that could be possible.
Okay.
Because beauty and the good has a lot more to do with the relationality and the way in which these different things are interacting and behaving as a unity than it is about just looking at this property in isolation or that property in isolation.
Mm. Okay. Okay. I see.
Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, it's an issue of subtlety. Like a lot of people aren't really understanding that relationship or
Mm.
with
So
forms and all that.
it's not the form itself, but the form in relationality. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, like so. Yeah, it has partly to do, yeah, with the way in which they also, yeah, in the way in which they interact and which they also form unities in different ways.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Composition.
I almost feel like that's a Christian baptized version of Platonism.
Yeah, like in what sense?
I don't know how to well,
Wait, what?
like for example, right? Like the center of Christian theology is the death and the resurrection of Christ, right? And the sort of the Christian spiritual discipline that the crucifix is trying to cultivate in Christians is the idea that beauty is found in this crucified slave, right? That in a sort of like, if you, I don't know, I don't know how to articulate this, but like from a sort of non-Christian perspective, or like from a pagan or even a Platonic view, that would not be considered um, beautiful unless for the relationality that it has with the world. Does that make sense? I don't know if that made sense. It was just
Partly.
okay. Um, okay, so I'll go back to the sort of this, measuring someone's jawline to understand how attractive they are and like how objectively people find them. Like that person might not be like you could have from that standard a very objectively ugly person, quote unquote. But then if you get to know them and then how they interact with the world, you see a beauty in it that you would not have seen if you just focused on their jawline, right?
Right. Because there are deeper levels of beauty, right? So it
Correct.
also has to do with character, things like that,
Sure.
right? So in that sense, that's a situation where, see, and also because again, remember, that's the reason for that is because remember, as a human being, like, yes, there is a sense in which the body obviously attracts us,
Hmm.
but that really isn't the whole thing, right? You see what I'm trying to say? Because we also have other components to us. There is the spiritual or the soul or the mental, whatever component to the person. And so there are situations where that, because it's a more primary or a more consequential property in many ways, and also something that's more enduring. Whereas, like for example, the body can change, and of course, especially with youth, the beauty of youth is going to fade. Things can just change, with age. Because some people, just as they get older, they eat and do everything the same way, but they, can't keep the exact same figure that they did or whatever it is. So that there's a sense in which it has to do with looking at a very subjective or contingent beauty versus a beauty that can be far more enduring, far more solid, and that ends up being far more consequential in the long run to some extent. And so that's kind of the idea, is that beauty is also just not reducible only to, like, yes, there are such things as beautiful or non-beautiful bodies in a sense, but you could still love somebody even if they didn't have the most beautiful body, because they could still be a beautiful person in general.
Correct.
Right? And a person isn't only their body.
Right. But so that's what I'm saying, is that like that reading of Plato could very well be a sort of a Christian, and if I want to be a lot less patronizing, a more religious understanding of Plato, where it's very easy for someone who does not start from the presuppositions of religion to
I'd say Platonism is inherently religious. It was seen, like, especially in this later development, as a religion. And the thing is, it's not just Christian. It unified paganism and Christianity and other cults around the world. Actually, that's what DBH, David Bentley Hart, talks a lot about. Actually, I read his History of Christianity, how Alexandria was this hub of Platonism, and practically the pagan and Egyptian cults versus the Christian had very different lifestyles and like rituals and ethics and stuff. But on the metaphysical level, their philosophers pretty much all agreed. And so, and I think that's what Perl is doing. Is Perl is going back through this kind of religious worldview, and Perl is not a Christian, at least now. But he does see it through this kind of he's trying to retrieve that this is a kind of a little more of a cohesive religious outpouring as opposed to an abstract particular philosopher. So it's a different way. It is a different way of reading it, but that's kind of his whole point. He wants to read it differently.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Plato actually really does talk about this, though. He actually is like, it's not just something that you extrapolate through the Christian lens. Like, I mean, if you look at Platonic dialogues, he talks about this a whole bunch. There's a lot of instances where he's talking about like Alcibiades as like a beautiful person on the outside, but then talking about, contrasting that with the beauty that is, that exists within the soul, that the soul is what you should be paying attention to. So, I mean, technically speaking, yes, there's a sense in which maybe you can call it, a Christian sort of thing here and there. But I mean, I honestly, like with the Platonic dialogue, because again, like it can be hard when we're just kind of talking about the concepts without all those little examples that he gives. That's partly why it can be kind of weird. But like when you read a number of areas, like, I mean, there's a whole lot of places like where for example, like Socrates himself was considered in some sense physically not very attractive at all, but then there was a sense in which they talk about how certain people still thought he was like one of the most beautiful and amazing people because of the quality of the soul. And he said the soul is what matters. That's the part that's going to, that endures, that lives on, and you need to worry about that far more than the other things which aren't reliable. Like, they're fine, they're good, they're still important, you maintain them, you care for them, they have their place, but that's not the entire goal, because eventually you're not going to have any of those characteristics. Especially when you die, you won't have those anymore. You're only going to have the beauty that you collected through your knowledge, your virtues, and whatnot. And so it's there in Plato as well, for sure.
I feel like Justin is reenacting a neoclassical painting right now. He's like,
I stepped out for just a minute. Can you take me back? So how did this very engaging topic, how did it come up again?
I was mostly annoying Brian. That's what happened.
Okay.
But I was asking about the proportions, because when Adrian Aiden talked about the good and the beautiful. There's a portion where Eric talked about proportion being important to beauty. And so we kind of got into a rabbit trail of how people can misunderstand that.
Yeah, so Fraser was kind of asking about, like, for example, like, that if we talk about this idea of there being like a form of beautiful, or like a perfect form or perfect version, or like a good version of something, then like wouldn't that mean you start having issues of where there's like this one perfect body type, or one perfect, this or that, like, where it completely removes any of the subjective senses of beauty, and how there can be different combinations of beautiful bodies, or this or that, and things like that. And so then we were talking about the differentiation, about how that's actually a very big misunderstanding of the use of, or understanding what good or beautiful means in terms of the form of the beautiful and all that. And that it actually does leave a lot of room for like, it has a lot to do with the relationality, with the way in which the things are united, not just about the properties in isolation, but about how the properties actually fit together and behave with one another, as opposed to just saying, oh, this property is ugly and shouldn't be in any combination whatsoever. Whereas you would say, no, this property being in certain combinations would be beautiful, because beauty and goodness is coming out of that unity, or that the something greater than the sum of the parts. That's what we were talking about, basically. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Of me. That's hilarious.
Yeah. No, but those are all. Those are those are the good questions, because that's what trips those things trip a lot of people up, a lot.
Yeah,
and
because I think there's this, I don't know, there can be social pressures for men to look a very certain way, and especially for women to look a certain way.
Oh, totally.
Well,
and I get it. Like there's certain type of bodies that are very pleasing to look at, right? And there's some truth to that. But I think what's missing in the sort of the conversation is that all we should look for, right?
Yeah, no. And even when it comes to like body types, it's actually not as obvious as we would think, right? Like, so we like to think that there's an ideal male or female body type, but when we actually like look at regular people, or what people will say, no, I mean, there are a lot of people have all kinds of different standards of what they prefer, even physically. It's really not that simple, right? I mean, like, because there at all, like, there are people who emphasize certain features over the other, where they want them to be bigger, smaller, thinner, thicker, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's actually not really true that.
But I think there's a spectrum, right? Once you go out of the spectrum, then there is such a thing as like for example, it's not very pleasing to see a person who's like 700 pounds, and it's not very pleasing to see someone who is anorexic.
Well, I mean, but those are also examples of like those are, a lot of that reflects like this idea of the extremes of because the thing is, you can also detect when something is in a sense not healthy. You see what I'm saying? So it's not the issue that, for example, being a bit bigger or being kind of thinner, like any one of them is objectively better than the other, but being 700 pounds is an indicator of something different. You see what I'm trying to say? Because like a body can accommodate a certain amount of thinness or thickness without compromising the integrity of the actual system. But then any extremes in those areas, you're literally looking at something that's not sustainable. So it's not even just like 700 pounds is just ugly because it's big. It's also just not sustainable for a body. A human body can't really do that healthily in any way or shape or form. You see what I'm saying?
There's a way in which also there has to be that in you. I mean, both things are true. People say that opposites attract, and people say that like seeks like, right? And I think both are true. I mean, just give you a concrete example. I'm not attracted to supermodels, right? And I don't know if I'm just weird in that or like, but I'm attracted to like normally attractive people, right? So I don't know, you know.
I feel you. I'm the
So
same way.
Well, yeah. I think there's part of us that's also conditioned to certain, like, that's where the culture comes in, as to like, you know, I grew up in a time where it was extremely attractive to be super slim, and so it almost is a discipline for me to like people who are a little bit more thicker, right? But yeah, I think that's where that's where the cultural aspect of it comes, I think. In any case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So-
like in individual instances of what's beautiful or whatnot, like those can be, you know, in
Right.
great variety. But there are certain things that are in common, is the idea that even you can have many different standards of that, but that there still ends up being a kind of unity in the sense that you can understand sort of that like there may not be a pattern in terms of this property, but we understand that it has to do with combinations, right? In a certain sense, that it has to do with, and we know, for example, certain like extremes are not going to work out very well, and so on and so forth. Like if you really work at it, you can see certain kinds of principles that can come up, but they allow for a lot of combinations.
Mm-hmm.
On a different topic, I have a question for Brian. The end of this chapter starts talking about the demiurge and the paradigm of the cosmos, or the receptacle of cosmos. And reading about this receptacle and the paradigm reminds me of Sophia and sophiology, because that's kind of the whole principle of sophiology, is that she is the paradigm or she is the receptacle. But I was going to ask Brian, is there any consistent or like any idea of what the demiurge is in Christian theology or Christian tradition? Is that ever like passed down what the demiurge is? Is it the logos, or is it something more like below the logos?
I need
or something
to.
like
Well, I'm doing some research on that now, and that new book by Harry Wolfson, which I'm going to upload the PDF soon. But he goes into how the logos is distinguished from the Holy Spirit, and how because previously they were associated, like they're all I think various different possibilities are tried out, right, within the context of Christian philosophy, theology, you know, so and kind of how it should be correlated with the demiurge, or with you know, like, so there's a particular way in which you know, there are certain theologies where you could see the logos and the Holy Spirit as one, and one with the demiurge, or there are others in which those would be distinguished in some way. And you know, certainly it's interesting to see those approaches where Sophia is its own reality that is neither the logos nor the Holy Spirit, but another kind of mediatory principle. And I think they're all interesting, and they all have implications, and I'm not decided in that sense that I have a gung-ho position as yet, but you know, sort of still thinking through
Okay, yeah.
what the
'Cause-
implications would be. Yeah.
I didn't know, like, whenever I encounter the demiurge character, I never where to put him, like in my understanding of the world.
Well,
I liked
one interpretation you saw, which I think is in Perl, right, is that the demiurge is the ideas, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
actually, I just
is
reading that, I really like that. It helped me understand it more. But
Yeah,
like, I think there's this temptation to make the demiurge fallen, like with us a little bit, because the world is fallen, yet it's still ordered. You know, like we want to like make sense of the order of the fallen world. But I don't think Plato did that at all. Maybe that's just our Miltonian
Yeah.
Yeah,
a little bit.
and reminds me of there's a section in Wolfson where he goes into Gnosticism, and also why he says why Gnosticism is not a philosophy. So it's which I think it seems like, you know, Hart would basically agree with that in a sense. Like it, you know, it has a certain story and it has its cosmology, but it's not it's not a speculative philosophy proper. It's not metaphysics. It's not
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was gonna ask about this because, you know, like Hart's book, The Experience of God, he talks about the demiurge in terms of something lesser than the classical theist conception of God, and that it's like a craftsman putting the world together rather than the intelligible existence by which all things exist. And so I was a little surprised in how Perl characterizes the demiurge, because he seems to be situating it sort of just God, and this is like Plato's conception of God. And this is just what God is. So I was puzzling over that a little bit. I don't know the right way to see it. Kind of like you were saying, right?
I'm not sure I saw in the Timaeus the demiurge as big G God. Because the demiurge does seem to be like kind of on top of this reality in like conceivable forms, but maybe that's my assumption. But I still kind of saw a God as everything, a panentheist worldview in the Timaeus, like because even though the demiurge is kind of the top dog, he's still an actor inside the world. But maybe I'm wrong. At least that's how he's portrayed, I thought, in the Timaeus. Whether that's what Plato wanted us to get from that, I don't know. Because I feel like after reading Perl, I need to go back and read the Timaeus all over again because I didn't understand it the first time I read it.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll have to do more reading on that to know. But it seems kind of hard to place exactly based on what Brian's saying. I mean, there's different opinions on that, I guess.
Yeah. Also, the whole doctrine of fall, or like fallenness versus finiteness, is really messy. I feel like in Christian theology, especially coming from the Protestant world, fallenness is like only ethical, and in some worlds it's like only metaphysical. And then how much is it both or neither? And then relating that to how the world works or should work is complicated. Something I'm not prepared to go into right away.
Yeah, that comes down to the way certain theologians look at it, right? So that's kind of because when we're thinking about the fall, we're not just thinking about the fall, we're thinking about, you know, Augustine's version of the fall, or I don't know, Origen's version of the fall, or whatever, you know what I mean? So that's partly the thing too, right? It's just like how you were talking about, like, you know, lenses of lenses of lenses, right? So we're not usually, you know, contemplating the fall directly, like just looking at the biblical narrative. What we're actually doing is talking about the commentary on the fall by various people, and then that's where you get a lot of stuff, right? Yeah.
Yeah, very complicated thought.
Yeah, kind of like I was. I mean, I would say it's both, and like I was saying last week, I think that the fall is something finite per se, but I do think it's metaphysical as well, because you actually have the way I look at it is it's a fall from being holistic. I actually like the way C.S. Lewis put this in the poem, and that he situates primal man, unfallen man, as being totally in control of his faculties, and one spiritual whole, and his body is just in full alignment with that. And then when the fall happens, he kind of falls into fragmentation and lack of control, and he's just controlled by his passions. So there's a sort of, even if, you could be finite and unfallen, but you still would have some kind of semblance of the holistic nature of God, because you'd still be under the control of this one mind that you're constituted of. You know what I mean? So you're in the image of God, even though you don't have to be finite to be, or you don't have to be infinite to be unfallen. Finiteness and fallenness are not the same thing, but there's a sort of parallel aspect. Sorry, I'm just trying to get something. I'm done though.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, we're thinking about also just the way things are translated and also connotations, right? Like talking about like the word fall in English has a very like we tend to think about it like as, you fell down, like, you made a mistake and you fell over or whatever. But like again, that's why like in many ways like it depending on how you're looking at it, like it makes like fall is not really the best word, or at least not the best word in our language. Not necessarily that the term that's whatever's used in the actual the Greek or whatever is a problem, but at least the way that we're using it in English can be a problem, right?
Yeah.
Because
I
because
think,
because of connotations.
and I
Because
think
because otherwise you
theologies.
can think about descent. If you think about descent in procession, that's
Uh-huh.
not inherently negative. Yes, it comes with a
Yeah.
lot of consequences, right? It still includes the things that fall implies to some extent, but not
Mhm.
necessarily in the most narrow sense of just being an error of some kind, right?
Right.
Or
Yeah,
something that
I think
God
that's
didn't
where
intend, it did something stupid, and that's why we're here, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Yeah.
modern readings of the Bible or theology are have similar problems to modern readings of like Plato. Is that like there was tons of things that were metaphors, at least originally, that become so like solid in our consciousness, they lose that metaphorical and become like, oh, we like literally fell from heaven and that's where we are at now, because we did, like it, we imply so much in these words that it's kind of hard to like think about, oh, it was
Yeah.
implying something else maybe.
Oh, I would say,
English is really bad at carrying the same breadth of meaning as other languages. That's a big part of the problem too.
Oh, really?
I
Yeah,
want
like
to
if you
put.
just look at it to some extent. Oh, here, go ahead, Justin.
Oh no. Actually, you're on the topic. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that like yeah, part of it has to do with semantic range. You know what I mean? Like if you look at different languages, there are certain languages that are far more that they lend themselves better to metaphoricalism and like having or implying or being more clear about the possibility of ranges of meanings. Whereas like English can be a bit stiff to some extent in
I can definitely
comparison to
see
something
that.
like Arabic or Greek or Hebrew, stuff like that.
Especially Hebrew, yeah.
Yeah, so that's partly the issue, is that it partly has to do with just the nature of English and sort of the thinking behind the structure of English. Now, of
Yeah.
course, not that English is incapable of doing that. Obviously, we have subtlety, sarcasm, all sorts of,
Mhm.
we have all that in our languages. English is very sophisticated, clearly. But it can be a little more difficult, or it takes a bit more you have to be more explicit sometimes and
Mhm.
work it a little more. Like there's more difficulty doing that stuff with English than there is with some other languages to some extent.
Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say that you know to qualify what I was saying. Yeah, I was saying that like finiteness as such or creatureliness as such is not fallen. I like that clarification. Yeah, you could use the word fall to indicate a procession, a creaturely procession from the divine. Um, that's a good point. But also I wanted to say that like I do think that the world that we exist in is not the ideal world that God created it to be, and not in the not in the younger's creation, like where everything kind of fell into disarray or when people sin, but just in terms of, I think heart is actually covered just a little bit. I don't remember where, but a lot of people in the David Bentley Heart group talk about this, that the world is disfigured in some kind of fundamental sense. The world as we experience it, that is. So I think that like there's a heavenly realm, which is creation as God intended it to be, the angelic realm, but then this world is definitely disfigured and fallen. So there can be a conflation between the world as we experience it and creatureliness as such, so that it feels as if, just the fact that we're creatures, kind of like how people say, well, of course, we sin and we make mistakes and we kill and steal and everything's human. Not realizing that, like, the human essence doesn't come from the human essence. That's the beginning of the we're not made to be like that. But anyway, I just had to digress a little bit on that because there's a nuance as well.
Yeah, like if you remember what I was talking about last week about like the relationship between acquiring knowledge and the necessity of descending or falling in order to do that. That's kind of what that's kind of the thing. And that's like, when I was talking about the smiley version of the fall, that's kind of what I'm talking about, is that it has to do with this idea that, yes, like if you look at the Quran, there's also a sense in which it mentions that the fall is like a dangerous and foolish thing that humans undertake to some extent, but it also ironically is also the way to, the ultimate experience in many ways. Like it's one of those things that you can't take lightly. And the idea is that humans didn't understand the full implications of what they will have to do. But the idea is that in the all, though, it is not an actual negative event, right? And that's kind of like that's kind of what I did with my the paper that I wrote and that I presented for a conference, on an Ismaili take on the lost son parable. Is that when you look at it in that sense, it actually makes so much sense as to why because people always wonder, like, why does because like if you think about, the older brother has a good point, right? Why did the little brother, who completely screwed up and did the dumbest things possible, why does he get these things and I'm treated as if like I didn't really matter that much and that my lifelong obedience wasn't that important, and yada yada yada. That whole thing ends up making far more sense when you have this kind of understanding of fallenness, actually. You realize that those characters are representing, a contrast between, like, where the lost son is more like humanity, whereas the older brother are like the angels or other beings who have static positions of the soul, where their soul can neither descend nor ascend in any way possible.
I think it's really helpful to see that from other traditions, because the Christian creation story and fall is very morality play-y, right? It's like that's kind of what the Edenic story is. It's a morality play, and also all of popular Christian theology kind of after that, or like pop surface level Christian theology, tends to make the whole story just Eden and then Jesus. Like that's like the two elements of the story. Like fall and redemption. You are bad humanity. Jesus, good humanity. Like that's the whole story. Where
and Islam mostly does that too. Mostly, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
but really, you read the story, it's a little more complex.
Because it brings up contradictions. That's the idea, right? Like sometimes people wonder, like, okay, how do you come up with these interpretations that are so weird or sometimes so different from what the story seems to say? Well, a lot of it is actually, again, because of internal integrity. Because even though it may look like that way of looking at the story is the most obvious or literal or the most grounded, there's also a sense in which it completely isn't, right? Because of all the implications that it raises for the nature of God, for the nature of humanity, what it actually means that we were created or brought here, like there's a whole lot of problems and things that brings up. You know, like the actual regular fall story, just taken that way, is really, really messed up in a lot of senses. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, there's also concept in, especially in the church fathers, of Felix culpa. You're familiar with that? Basically, it's the Latin for happy fall, and what it is that because of the Christ's redemption, like his becoming man, God becoming man, and so divinizing, like God became man, so the man might become God. So through that, you know, he did that because we fell, and so it's a good thing that we fell because then we have so much glory because of that. Now, of course, that involves the whole redemption part that I don't know if you're like sidestepping or what, but actually there is a sense in which it interprets the fall as a positive thing. Well, within
Yeah,
the Christian
totally. Yeah.
context. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that I would agree that basically
Mm-hmm.
the Christ figure is exactly that's what ends up making it all worthwhile.
Right.
Because because the whole reason why the descent or the fall is good is because of the ascent, the ability to ascend, right? The fall would suck if we just fell down and that was it, right? But the
And
fact
Yeah.
that the chain of being is there and that you
Yeah.
have the Christ figure who allows you to climb back up, that's what makes falling down worthwhile. So yeah, that's
Mhm.
exactly what I would
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And the Reformed tradition has like a different way around that. I remember hearing that both Jesus' death and the fall were necessary and good, but not in the way it happened. Like basically God had planned to give the fruit of knowledge of good and evil to Adam, and he took it too early. And then Jesus came to die, or like to give him to pour himself out as a an offering, but he did it this way because this happened, right? So I don't know, that's
Yeah.
their
That's
way
a very
around that.
early interpretation as well in the church fathers.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely better. I think it still ends up leaving a bit of an issue in the sense of like,
Mhm.
well, how did they eat the apple early? Like why was that even possible, right? If you think
Yeah.
about it, like why would God just leave the apple there, right? And would he not know that that's going to happen? And
Yeah.
there's a
Well,
whole lot of it still ends up being a big problem to some extent. Like
well, if you interpret it
yeah.
to literally, yes, I think you come with this problem.
Yeah.
I think really what it is that you take the sort of emotive aspect of it, in that what was Eve being tempted to think? Well, fundamentally, she was being tempted about their status and everything, and that they were not enough, and that they had to acquire an element of wisdom in order that they didn't have in order, in fact, God was depriving them of in order to attain to, like, they're already named God. In a way, they're already like the Elohim, right? And so now Yahweh does say they have become like us, they eat it, but what it is that they're like this divine knowledge for themselves, and so they're trying to kind of yank it from away from God and out of distrust, and that creates this sort of distortion in the relationship with God. And so that if you take that more deeper sense of it, it makes a little more sense than just like over like concretizing the whole thing. Like, oh, they yanked the fruit off the tree for their sister. Like, that's
Yeah,
most,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
The literalism is the problem. Yeah, like the idea
Yeah.
that there literally was
Yeah.
an apple and he said no, don't don't eat it, but somehow he still puts it out there saying, oh, I'm gonna put this right over here and I'm gonna tell you it's like got the ultimate knowledge of good or evil, but don't touch it. But don't touch it.
Right. Yeah.
Like, yeah, so of course, like the way that the story is written for a reason. So it's not about saying that the way the narrative is spelled out in the Bible or any scripture is the problem itself, but it has to do with, again, with the reading of it, right? So
Yeah.
all that is intentional. This idea that, oh, there's something treacherous or a bit dangerous about the fruit is part of the point, because even the Quran says that, right? That okay, the humans were a bit foolish when they made this decision to do this, because they didn't realize all the crap that will come with it. Yes, there is the opportunity for ultimate glory, and it is worth it technically in the end, but we were definitely not prepared for what actually living in this world means, and we can see how clearly that it sucks in so many ways, right? It's horrible and in all kinds of in every sense of the word, in many senses, right? So in that sense, yes, that part of the message, or that like idea that the fruit is also in some sense not for everyone, or or something that comes with this whole dark aspect to it, it's true. Like it has that has to be there in the story in order to communicate that part to you.
I read one time a great parallel for this, or metaphor for this, and that like sex is awesome and it's a good thing, but you can't get kids involved in it, or like start violating their minds, sexual concepts. When they're like little toddler, or like even a preteen, and that's sort of a metaphor for that. Like they weren't ready for it, so it gets all messed up in their mind, becoming sexually unhealthy later on. In the metaphor of the kid, especially if they're molested, or something like that. And so, yes, I mean the fruit, what the fruit symbolizes, the knowledge of good and evil, could be considered a inherently good thing, but they just were not at the place where they're able to really digest and understand what that totally means. And so they were on a trajectory, because they're already in the image of God. They're in a process where they would be divinized, but they weren't ready for that level of understanding, and they didn't actually grasp it. And so that's why our morality is so messed up. It's like, yeah, we have a sense of morality, but look at the way it's manifested across the world. A lot of times that's actually the problem, is false moralities and self-righteousness, and like condemning others. The institutional corruption is even worse than just perverse carnal vices, and that it actually propagates them as well. Like as you see the Gospels, Jesus is constantly getting on the moralizers for how much of a wreck they're making everything. They're actually barring people from the kingdom of heaven by disallowing them from being healed.
No, yeah, and you're right, right? That's exactly what goes into the whole thing of why esotericism is something you're initiated into, right? Your analogy of the whole sexual thing of being, not for kids, but for older people, that's itself a symbol, right? Because remember, esotericism and the sexuality thing, that is what Plato is talking about, and that ends up being in other faiths too. Like that's actually a pretty major metaphor for sexuality actually being the whole master disciple relationship in many ways. That's exactly what the point is, right? And what's the big example, right? Like if we look at what we were talking about with Fraser, about how what happens when people who are not ready for esoteric knowledge learn about the forms, you can have these weird corruptions of what the form of the beautiful is, or the form of the good is. And that's the example of someone receiving that knowledge who did not have a heart or an intellect that was prepared for it, right? So they had the esoteric teaching, but they also didn't, right? They had the text of it, but its actual essence was beyond their grasp, and in fact ended up becoming something that backfired, because they really didn't have, in a sense, divine permission to behold that. And so they think they capture it, but what they actually do is it actually leads to ruin, in a sense, because that wasn't for them. They weren't supposed to see that yet. So exactly, yeah. So there is a sense in which that's partly the pitfall, or like what why knowledge is also given this dark quality, because you're not always ready for knowledge, or for certain levels of knowledge. And you can get through to a lot of confusion. Like it's not just absorbing knowledge in itself is not always just a good thing. Like there's a systematic,
Yeah.
way of going about it, and there are all kinds of the things that you have
But,
to.
Like for
Yeah.
instance, like what I was saying about the Felix Gulf of the Happy Fall. You can't start there and be like, oh, this is so good. Yeah. No, you have to
Mhm.
start with an understanding that this was a very, very bad thing. And then you have to start with the
Yes.
law. That like, well, you have to have some boundaries on what's right and wrong and stuff like that. And then you can
Yes.
understand grace. So there's a natural progression. If you get those out of order, then you're going to have a totally distorted understanding of it.
Yeah. No, like exactly. Yeah, that's the law is the first stage. Like
Yeah.
people who would you wouldn't really be allowed to go into these other essences or meanings if you haven't
Mhm.
already placed the body and the mind under disciplines. That's really
Yeah.
what the point of the law is to actually put you in the right frame of mind to read things appropriately, right? Because you
Mhm.
read things the way that you are. So you're not going to find virtue or beauty in the Bible if you're not beautiful and
Mhm.
virtuous in some sense, right? Like, of course,
Yeah.
there are levels of it, right? You ascend to higher levels, but there's a certain kind of minimal beauty and virtue that has to sort of be preparationally there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, all you're going to do is read your own, negative aspects in the text.
Mhm.
Yeah. hmm
Cool.
Yeah. That's exactly what those sorts of things are about.
Yeah, I was looking at your. I'll have to look at this conference. I've interacted with Khalil a few times.
Yeah, he's basically the whole reason why I know anything at all.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, he was my big. He was my initiator, you could say. Like that's how I entered this entire universe and somehow made any sense of it. Because
Wow.
getting in, yeah, like I got into this stuff when I was like 23, like 8 years ago.
Mhm.
So there was so much to figure out and figure like where to. Yeah,
You have pretty good breadth, man.
his articles and stuff were my entryway into making this all make sense, and
I'd say you have
talking him to him personally and stuff as well and whatnot.
I'd say you have a pretty impressive breadth of knowledge at this point. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. We're always
Um,
learning. We never feel like we. I always feel like I'm behind. As much as I know that there's so
oh,
much
I
more
feel
to
the
know.
same way. I feel
Yeah.
the same way. Because there's a lot more. There's just so much left.
Yeah.
There's still a lot to look at.
Mhm.
hmm Yeah, but again, that's kind of why the experience is in some sense more important. Like we can get lost thinking we're actually supposed to read every little thing and that
Right.
we haven't
Yeah.
accomplished anything until we've actually read it. But remember, like what we talked about last time, the real point of it is that it's supposed to convince us to do the inner work, right? That's where
Yeah.
you actually learn a lot
Yeah.
more. And also because the thing is, the more inner work you've also done, the less you actually have to read because you end up taking a lot more out of what you read. Like you'll end
Yeah.
up being able to pull out things that somebody may have had to read 5 books to understand. You might figure that out in seeing it in a paragraph, and you might suddenly have the essence of that concept without even needing to look at all that. And of course, there's
Yeah.
still an importance of reading because why? For didactic reasons, right? Because for transmission. That's primarily why I do a lot of reading. Is not because like I have like a million questions left. Like I'm pretty firm in what I believe and what I have, and so there aren't as many like major theological questions I have left. But I read for the sake of transmission, so that there are different ways I can talk about it, express it, use different vocabulary, use look for like some of the really good phrasing from different traditions and whatever. So that's a lot of like what it's for. It's about transmission. It's about protecting the community, right? And um, helping the community still be confident in that the path works, so to speak, right? Being able to explain it and defend it. That's a lot of what theology is big purposes. But yeah, like I mean, we're not going to read everything, and nor should we feel like we have to read everything in order to have accomplished, the goal of actual union or gnosis or whatever.
I'm very similar to you in that regard. I do want to learn more about Plato, because I think there might be.
You faded out a bit there.
Oh, I said it. We're very.
He cut out now.
Oh, whatever. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, like it keeps going up and down. Like you'll like have normal volume, and then suddenly like
I think it's your
it
beard.
gets softer, and then
Is this better? Right here?
yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. What I was saying is that we're very similar in that regard and all of that. I tend to learn, pretty fairly quickly, without having to read a whole lot. But also, I would like to learn more about cosmic hierarchy, because I think there's more to learn in that dimension, but that's very esoteric, very almost like occult knowledge that very few people have. But
You'll definitely like On the Mysteries, then the book that I
Okay.
mentioned before. If
Yeah.
you want to know about cosmic hierarchy, it really helps to look at that book. Yeah, like that, and I think Proclus to some extent too, even though like Proclus kind of is even more elaborate. I can't speak completely to how much I agree with Proclus because I haven't read any Proclus just yet.
It's almost
Iamblichus
true
I
to-
can definitely attest to because I read that book and I know what's in there, and
There's
I've
also
done more. Yeah.
Pseudo Dionysius.
Yes, that's a good one too. If you want to look at procession.
Yeah, I've
yeah,
read
his
a little
celestial
bit.
hierarchy and ecclesiastical hierarchy are.
Yeah.
The ecclesiastical hierarchy is one that really interests me because there's something very similar to that we have in my tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as in, how does the great chain of being also connect to human beings, in a sense? Because we think of just the procession in terms of, oh, there's us, and then there's all these entities above. But the idea of the ecclesiastical hierarchy or the Ismaili Dawa extends that into humans who are also part of the rungs of the ladder.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of masters, different levels of masters or ranks of souls who serve certain purposes and are able to initiate us into certain
Yeah.
levels. And then you then have to seek somebody greater than that for the next, level of it. And that there is a chain, like there's always a chain of human beings that are available to various people that will allow you to then make contact with the noetic realities and whatnot.
Have you guys read that portion in Plato? I don't know. I think it's in the Apology, or one of the last ones. No, it's gonna be in the Phaedo or the Meno, where he's looking for someone wiser than he is. That reminds me of that. And like,
Yeah.
he honestly he believes he is not wise, and so he's like, oh, it's probably pretty easy to find someone wiser than me. But his end conclusion is that no one else is wise either.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and there's a lot to unpack in what he's actually trying to say there, right?
Yeah.
Because he clearly believes he knows something. It's not quite, you know what I mean? Because like he's doing all this stuff, which where he is clearly making these claims, right? I mean, because again, if you really don't have any wisdom and aren't wise in any way, then how do you identify, right? That what it looks like, right? The only way that he would be able to say I'm not wise and neither are you, is if he knows something about what wisdom is that nobody else is realizing to some extent.
Well,
You know what I mean?
no,
So
that's what he says. He says,
Yeah.
my wisdom is I don't know. I know I'm not wise, where you think you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. So yeah, so there's actually like a much more complicated thing going on in what he's actually saying there. Like, because it's about like levels or of knowledge or knowing, right? So he's probably talking to some extent about that he probably has a lot further he could have gone or could go in terms of really making direct contact, with some of these realities, but that like perhaps intellectually he's come to understand them, and so he's able to communicate them, talk about them. But that there's a sense in which he admits that it's not complete in that sense, and so he's kind of saying that the people who are truly wise are actually people who have been completely perfected, who are completely united with those concepts, with their very being, as opposed to just them as ideas, as abstract things.
Mhm.
And so in that sense is what I think he means when he says that he's not truly wise, is that I think he's trying to acknowledge that he hasn't really ascended to the top of the ladder in a sense, and that there are people who have probably achieved a greater unity or annihilation in those realities than he has.
It's like the conference I went to the other day. Like I'm not wise. Given wisdom as a gift. So in a sense, you say I'm not wise because you recognize a wisdom which is given to you is not you per se, but that you recognize something external to you, but yet dwells within your soul. I mean, because God is wisdom. Like, so God pervades all things, but all things are not God. God is all things.
Yes.
Well, that's
Mhm.
I've loved this, but my eyes are closing
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I need to get some more sleep.
voluntarily. Thank you,
Cool.
Karine or Karen, for being around this whole time. I think it's is it 3:30 there for you too? That's where it is for me.
And talked
And-
this whole time.
Yeah, sorry we didn't get a chance to talk. We were being too loud. But thanks for being with us, for sure.
Yeah. Hopefully he got something out of it at least.
Yeah. I know you asked the question in chat that you answered, so without being able to give a specific answer.
But yeah, but like the yeah, before we go though, but yeah, like if you want to know a bit more about like, so for example, like Iamblichus doesn't have as elaborate of like, you know, system as Proclus, but like if you want to know especially more about the daimons
Mm-hmm.
and how they interact, and some things that are a bit like talking about these like angelic entities, lower and higher gods to some extent.
Yeah.
Like something that's a bit more detailed and fleshes out how that relates to us and how that relates to like epistemology, like what is divine inspiration, how do visions happen, how do prophetic
Ooh.
oracles, yeah, like so he has a whole interesting thing about that interaction, because that's it's all about theurgy. So it's basically where does the human and the divine blend, start to actually meet up. And
Yeah.
so you'll like that book, definitely.
Oh yeah. Oh good.
gets into that.
There's a panel where you can look at all the links and stuff. So I can look where I think you deposited that book in here somewhere.
Yeah, I can put it
Or-
again if you want me to just put it there again.
Yeah.
Let
I
me
think it
do
goes
that.
backwards. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that would be fine.